Let me tell you something about predators that most people never understand. The most dangerous ones don't announce themselves. They don't roar or bare their teeth. They lie perfectly still, conserving their strength, watching, waiting. The trapdoor spider builds its burrow and sits motionless for weeks, months even, until the moment a cricket steps on that silken trigger. Then, the attack is so swift, so brutal, that the prey never sees it coming. In the criminal underworld, this principle separates the legends from the corpses. John Gotti walked the streets of New York in $1,000 suits, making himself visible, untouchable, believing his presence alone was power. The FBI photographed him for years before finally putting him away for life. Meyer Lansky, on the other hand, was a ghost, a quiet accountant in rumpled suits who built an empire so vast that when he died, the government spent decades trying to find money they knew existed but could never trace. One man was a peacock, the other was a trapdoor spider. The lesson? True power doesn't perform, it waits. And tonight's story is about a man who understood that lesson better than anyone who came before him, a man the entire underworld dismissed as finished, broken, neutered by a car bomb that left him confined to a wheelchair. They called him the Broken Beast. They spoke slowly around him as if his mind had shattered along with his spine. They divided his territories in backroom meetings, certain that Ford Montgomery's reign had ended in that explosion 5 years ago. They had no idea he was counting every betrayal, writing every name in a ledger that would one day come due. His name was Ford Montgomery, 38 years old, covered in tattoos that told the story of wars fought and won, a buzz cut that made his thick neck look even more imposing, a scruffy beard that couldn't hide the sharp jawline underneath. Once the most feared mafia don on the East Coast, now reduced to a drooling invalid dependent on his lieutenants. Or so they believed. And then he needed a wife. Not for love, not for companionship, but as the final piece in a game of chess that had been playing out for 5 years. A woman who could move through spaces he couldn't reach from a wheelchair. A woman desperate enough to agree. A woman who had nothing left to lose. Fate delivered him Mabel Tinsdale, 26 years old, a woman with olive skin, sharp, arched eyebrows, and a straight nose that gave her features an aristocratic elegance her circumstances had never allowed her to claim. A woman whose father had used her as collateral in poker games since she was old enough to understand what the leering stares meant. A woman who had spent her entire life being invisible, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed like she was trying to disappear into herself. She walked into his fortress expecting to serve a broken man, expecting to be used and discarded like every other transaction in her life, expecting degradation, duty, and the slow death of whatever hope she still carried. And on their wedding night, when the doors were locked and the witnesses were gone, when she stood in that bedroom bracing herself for the worst, he rose from that wheelchair, stood to his full, imposing height, crossed the room on 2 perfectly steady legs, looked down at her with eyes sharp enough to cut through steel, and whispered the words that would bring an empire of traitors crashing down. Now, the real game begins. Let me take you back to a cramped apartment where Mabel Tinsdale was about to learn that the debts of fathers are paid in daughters' flesh, and that sometimes the most dangerous cage is the one you're born into. If this story speaks to something in your soul, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a moment. Because in this world, the ones who wait in silence always strike the hardest. The apartment smelled like stale cigarette smoke and broken promises. Mabel stood in the doorway of what her father generously called his study, a corner of the living room sectioned off by a stained curtain, littered with racing forms, empty bottles, and the accumulated debris of a man who had gambled away everything, including his dignity. Arthur Tinsdale sat hunched over a card table, his fingers trembling as they gripped a glass of bottom-shelf whiskey. He didn't look up when Mabel entered, didn't acknowledge her presence until she spoke. "You called for me?" Her voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of someone who had learned that showing feeling only gave people weapons to use against you. She stood with her arms crossed, her dark hair pulled back into a bun so tight it made her temples ache, wearing the same black work pants and white shirt she'd worn for her double shift at the diner. Arthur finally lifted his head. His eyes were blood-sunk, sunk into a face that had aged 20 years in the last 5. But there was something else there tonight, something Mabel had seen before and learned to fear, the desperate relief of a drumming man who'd just spotted driftwood. "Sit down, Mabel." "I'd rather stand." "Sit down." The command had an edge she recognized, the edge that meant he'd made a decision and her opinion on the matter was irrelevant. Mabel sat on the edge of the sagging couch, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had learned long ago to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible, as if by disappearing she might avoid whatever fresh hell her father had engineered. Arthur took a long drink, set the glass down with exaggerated care, and tried on a smile that looked more like a grimace. "I've got good news, the best news we've had in years." Mabel's stomach dropped. In her experience, her father's good news was always a prelude to catastrophe. "The debt," he continued, his voice gaining false enthusiasm, "the Montgomery debt. It's going to be cleared. Completely. We're going to be free, Mabel. Free." The name Montgomery hung in the air like a noose. Mabel felt ice crawl up her spine. 5 years ago, her father had borrowed money from Ford Montgomery to cover losses from an underground poker game. The interest had compounded into an amount that might as well have been $1 billion for all their ability to pay it. For 5 years, they'd lived under that debt like a sword hanging by a thread. Collection visits, threats, the slow certainty that eventually payment would come due in ways that had nothing to do with money. How? The word came out as barely a whisper. Arthur wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at his hands, at the table, at the walls, anywhere but at his daughter. Ford Montgomery has agreed to forgive the debt. All of it will be clear. In exchange for what? The silence stretched. Mabel could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the drip of the kitchen faucet they couldn't afford to fix, could hear the couple arguing in the apartment above. In exchange for what, Dad? Arthur finally looked at her, and in his eyes, Mabel saw something die. Whatever threadbare connection they'd maintained, whatever pretense that he was still her father and she was still his daughter, it evaporated in that moment. "He wants to marry you." The room tilted. Mabel heard the words, understood them individually, but together they made no sense. Marriage, Ford Montgomery, the broken beast, the man in the wheelchair. "You're selling me." It wasn't a question. "It's not like that. You're selling me to a crippled mafia boss to pay your gambling debt?" "Mabel, please, if you could just understand." "Understand what?" Her voice cracked, the emotion she'd fought to contain finally breaking through. "That my own father is trading me like I'm property? That after everything, after you gambled away Mom's insurance life, after you lost the house, after I've worked 2 jobs for 5 years to keep us alive, you're going to hand me over to a stranger?" Arthur's hands shook. "If you don't do this, they'll kill us both. This isn't a negotiation, Mabel. This is survival. Your survival. You think I want this? You think this is easy for me?" Mabel laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare make yourself the victim here." She stood, her legs unsteady, and walked to the grimy window that overlooked the alley. Outside, a stray cat picked through garbage. She wondered if the cat felt freer than she did. "When?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow. A car will come for you at noon. You'll meet him, and if things go well, the wedding will be in a week." A week. 7 days until she became Mrs. Ford Montgomery. 7 days until she traded one cage for another. Mabel closed her eyes and thought about running. She'd thought about it before, saving enough money, buying a bus ticket to somewhere her father's debts couldn't follow, but she'd never done it. Because, despite everything, some part of her still believed she had a responsibility to clean up his messes. That part of her, she realized, was what had kept her in chains all these years. Fine, she said. Arthur's relief was palpable. You'll do it? Mabel turned to face him, and he flinched at what he saw in her eyes. I'll do it. Not for you, not to save you, but because you're right about one thing. If I don't, they'll kill me too, and I'm not ready to die yet. She walked toward her tiny bedroom, then paused in the doorway. But understand this, Dad. After tomorrow, you and I are done. Whatever happened in that car, whatever this marriage turns into, you don't get to be part of it. You sold your daughter. That makes you nothing to me. Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but Mabel closed the door before he could speak. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on her narrow bed with its thin mattress and broken springs, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and let herself remember the last time she'd felt safe. She was 8 years old. Her mother was still alive. They were at the beach, and her mother was teaching her to swim, patient hands supporting her as she kicked and laughed and believed the world was a place where people took care of each other. That little girl was gone now, drowned somewhere in the years between then and now. In her place was a woman with olive skin that had lost its warmth, with sharp features that had hardened into a mask, with hair pulled back so tight it felt like armor. Mabel didn't know what kind of man Ford Montgomery was, didn't know if the rumors about him were true, that the explosion had left him not just paralyzed but brain damaged, that he drooled and raged and had to be managed like a violent child. She didn't know if she would survive this marriage, or if it would break whatever pieces of her were still intact. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done being a victim, done being silent, done making herself small. If Ford Montgomery thought he was buying a docile bride, a pretty ornament to wheel around his mansion, he was about to learn that Mabel Tinsdale had nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing to lose was the most dangerous thing in the world. As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, Mabel rose from her bed. She showered in the barely warm water, dressed in the only nice outfit she owned, a simple navy dress her mother had bought her years ago, and pulled her hair back with methodical precision. In the mirror, she looked like someone prepared for a funeral. In a way, she supposed she was. At exactly noon, a black car pulled up outside the building. Not just any car, a Mercedes S-Class, sleek and predatory, so out of place in this neighborhood that people stopped to stare. Mabel didn't look back at the apartment, didn't say goodbye to her father, who watched from the window like a coward afraid to face what he'd done. She simply walked out, got into the car, and let herself be driven toward whatever fresh hell awaited her. The driver didn't speak. The privacy partition was up. Mabel watched the city transform outside her window as they drove from her shabby neighborhood toward Manhattan's Upper East Side, from broken streets to pristine avenues, from struggle to wealth, from her old life to whatever came next. When the car finally stopped, Mabel looked up at the Montgomery estate and felt her breath catch. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. A Gothic mansion of gray stone and sharp angles, surrounded by walls topped with cameras, guarded by men in suits who looked like they knew 100 ways to kill you. This was the home of a king. Or a monster. Mabel supposed she was about to find out. The car door opened. A hand appeared, offering to help her out. Mabel ignored it. She stepped out of her own, her spine straight, her chin up, and walked toward the massive iron doors. Behind those doors, Ford Montgomery was waiting, and Mabel Tinsdale was done waiting for anything. The doors opened into a grand hall that belonged in a museum, not a home. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, a chandelier dripping crystal like frozen tears, walls lined with oil paintings of men who looked like they'd built empires on the backs of broken kingdoms. Mabel's footsteps echoed as she followed a silent butler through corridors that seemed designed to make visitors feel small. They stopped in front of double doors made of dark wood carved with intricate patterns that might have been beautiful if they hadn't looked so much like prison bars. The butler knocked once, opened the doors, and stepped aside without a word. Mabel walked into what appeared to be a study, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk the size of a dining table, windows overlooking manicured gardens that looked as lifeless as a postcard. And there, positioned behind the desk with his back to the window, sat Ford Montgomery. The wheelchair registered first. Black, industrial, the kind built for someone who'd be using it for life. But then Mabel's eyes adjusted to the backlit silhouette, and she saw the man himself. Ford Montgomery was a study in contradictions. His buzz cut emphasized a skull structure that looked carved from granite, all harsh angles and brutal efficiency. His neck was thick as a tree trunk, corded with muscle and covered in tattoos that crawled up from beneath his collar, intricate patterns of wolves and ravens and symbols Mabel didn't recognize. A scruffy beard framed a jaw that looked like it could bite through steel. Everything about him radiated power, violence barely contained. Everything except the wheelchair. He didn't greet her, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond a slow, methodical examination that started at her feet and worked its way up, cataloging her like she was livestock at auction. When his eyes finally met hers, Mabel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. They were dark, almost black, and completely devoid of warmth. Predator's eyes. Mabel Tinsdale. His voice was a low rumble, the kind that seemed to vibrate in your chest. Your father's payment. Not a question, not even really a statement, just an acknowledgement of a transaction. Mabel's fingernails dug into her palms. Is that all I am to you, a payment? Ford's expression didn't change. What else would you be? A person, perhaps. People have value beyond their utility. You're here because your father owed a debt he couldn't pay. That makes you currency, not a person. The casual cruelty of it should have shocked her, but Mabel had been treated like an object for too long to be surprised. Still, hearing it stated so baldly, with such complete indifference, ignited something in her chest, a hot coal of rage she'd been banking for years. "And what exactly am I purchasing for my father?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fury thrumming through her veins. "A husband who can't walk? A marriage to a cripple?" She meant to wound him, meant to get some reaction, some crack in that stone facade. Ford's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any humor. "Careful. I may be confined to this chair, but I still control everything that happens in this city, including what happens to difficult brides who forget their place." He rolled the wheelchair forward with surprising speed, stopping mere feet from where she stood. This close, Mabel could see the tattoos more clearly, a wolf's head on his neck, teeth bared in eternal snarl, could see old scars cutting through his beard, could smell expensive cologne mixed with something darker, more primal. Despite the wheelchair, despite the fact that she was standing and he was sitting, Ford Montgomery was the most physically intimidating man she'd ever encountered. Every inch of him screamed danger, barely leashed violence, the kind of man who'd killed with his bare hands and would do it again without hesitation. "Your father signed the papers this morning. You're mine now. The wedding is in 5 days. Until then, you'll stay here. You'll be fitted for a dress, you'll learn the basic rules of this house, and you'll keep your mouth shut unless I ask you a direct question. Understood?" Mabel stared down at him, at this broken king in his metal throne, and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent her whole life bowing to men who claimed ownership over her body, her time, her future. She'd made herself small and silent because survival demanded it. But looking at Ford Montgomery, at the cold calculation in his eyes, at the way he'd reduced her to an acquisition without even pretending otherwise, Mabel realized something fundamental. She was already dead to him, already nothing, which meant she had nothing left to lose. "No," she said quietly. Ford's eyebrows rose a fraction, the first genuine reaction she'd gotten from him. No? I'll marry you because the alternative is death. I'll live in this mausoleum and play whatever role you need, but I won't be silent. I won't pretend to be grateful for being bought like furniture, and I sure as hell won't call a man who treats me like property my husband. For a long moment, Ford said nothing, just studied her with those predator eyes, and Mabel wondered if she'd just signed her own death warrant. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, sharp and dangerous. "Good," he said. "I was worried you'd be boring." The wedding was a performance staged for an audience of vultures. Mabel stood in a dress that cost more than she'd earned in the past year, white silk that clung to her frame like a beautiful lie, and watched the guests watch her. Men in expensive suits with dead eyes, women dripping diamonds and contempt, all of them calculating, measuring, wondering what kind of fool would marry Ford Montgomery. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes. A judge spoke words Mabel didn't hear. Ford sat in his wheelchair at the altar, expressionless as carved stone, and said, "I do," like he was ordering coffee. When it came time for the kiss, he simply nodded at her, and she leaned down to brush her lips against his cheek. The beard was softer than she'd expected. The reception was worse. People approached to offer congratulations that sounded like condolences. They patted Ford's shoulder with poorly concealed pity. They looked at Mabel with curiosity and a knowing satisfaction, as if they understood exactly what transaction had taken place and were pleased to witness a woman being put in her proper place. Through it all, Ford remained silent, his hands resting on the wheelchair arms, his face a mask of indifference. Only once did Mabel see something flicker in his eyes, when a man with silver hair and a smile like a knife bent down to whisper something in Ford's ear. For just a moment, Ford's jaw tightened, and Mabel saw murder in his expression. Then it was gone, and he was nodding politely, the broken king accepting sympathy from his court. By the time they were finally alone, ascending in the private elevator to the master suite, Mabel's face hurt from maintaining a neutral expression. Ford wheeled himself into the elevator beside her, and they rode up in silence so thick it felt suffocating. The suite was massive, more like a luxury apartment than a bedroom. Dark wood furniture, a bed large enough to sleep 5, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. A prison with a view. Ford rolled inside, and Mabel heard the door close behind them. Then, the distinct click of a lock. Her heart rate spiked. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the moment every woman sold into marriage feared. She turned to face him, her hands clenched at her sides, preparing herself for whatever came next. Ford sat with his back to her, facing those massive windows. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then his hands gripped the wheelchair arms, and he stood up. Not carefully, not with the trembling effort of someone relearning to use damaged limbs. He stood in one fluid motion, his body unfolding to its full height like a predator rising from a crouch. Mabel's breath caught. Ford Montgomery stood at least 6'3", maybe taller. Without the wheelchair to diminish him, he was massive. Broad shoulders, powerful frame, every inch of him radiating the physical dominance the chair had concealed. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his neck with an audible crack, and turned to face her. The transformation was terrifying. In the wheelchair, he was dangerous. Standing, he was cataclysmic. "You..." Mabel's voice failed. She tried again. "You can walk?" "I can run," Ford corrected, taking a step toward her, then another. His movements were smooth, controlled, the gait of someone in complete command of their body. "I've been able to do it for 4 years. Mabel backed up until she hit the wall. "That's impossible. Everyone says what I wanted them to say." He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she had to crane her neck to look up to him. This close, the sheer physicality of him was overwhelming. 5 years ago, someone planted a car bomb meant to kill me. It failed, obviously, but it told me something important. I have a traitor in my organization. His hand came up and Mabel flinched, but he simply braced it against the wall beside her head, leaning down until they were eye level. So I made a choice, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I let them think the bomb succeeded. Let them think I was broken, harmless, no longer a threat. And I watched. I listened. I made notes of everyone who smiled a little too wide when they saw me in that chair. Everyone who thought they could whisper in corners because the cripple couldn't hear them. Everyone who started making moves on my territory because they believed I was too weak to stop them. Understanding crashed over Mabel like ice water. You've been playing dead. For 5 years. Ford's smile was razor sharp, and in 3 weeks, everyone who betrayed me is going to learn exactly how functional I am. But there's a problem. What problem? I can't be everywhere. There are meetings I can't attend without revealing the truth too early, places I can't go, people I can't confront while maintaining this fiction. I need someone who can move through spaces I can't reach, someone who people will underestimate because they'll be too busy pitying my poor wife to realize she's gathering intelligence. Mabel's mind raced, pieces falling into place. That's why you wanted to marry me, not as a payment, as a tool. I wanted someone desperate enough to agree and smart enough to be useful. Your father's debt gave me leverage. Your eyes gave me hope you had a brain. He straightened up, giving her space, but still towering over her. I am not broken, Mabel Tinsdale. I am waiting. And now, so are you. He turned and walked back toward the windows. Walked like he'd never spent a day in that wheelchair, leaving Mabel pressed against the wall, her heart hammering, her entire understanding of her situation rewriting itself. What happens in 3 weeks? She asked. Ford looked at her over his shoulder and the predator smile returned. I stand up in front of everyone who betrayed me, and then I remind them why they used to be afraid. He moved toward a door on the far side of the room. You'll sleep in here. I'll take the adjoining suite. Tomorrow, your real education begins, because if you're going to be my wife, you're going to be useful. He paused at the threshold. Oh, and Mabel, your father's debt is paid. You'll never see him again. I made sure of that. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving Mabel alone with the realization that she hadn't married a broken king. She'd married a loaded gun, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Mabel didn't sleep. She lay in the massive bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment Ford had arisen from that wheelchair over and over until it felt like a dream, except her racing pulse and the adrenaline still coursing through her veins confirmed it was terrifyingly real. At dawn, she finally gave up on sleep and showered in a bathroom larger than her old apartment. When she emerged, wrapped in a plush robe she'd found hanging on the door, Ford was sitting at a small table by the windows, standing height chairs, a breakfast spread that could feed 6 people, and 2 cups of coffee steaming in the morning light. He'd changed into dark slacks and a black button-down that did nothing to hide the powerful frame underneath. Without the chair, without the facade of weakness, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd built an empire on violence and control. Sit, he said, without looking up at the tablet he was reading. Mabel considered refusing on principle, but her stomach growled, betraying her. She sat, poured herself coffee, and waited. Ford set down the tablet and studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His gaze lingered on her face, her arched eyebrows, the sharp intelligence in her eyes that she'd learned to hide behind downcast lashes and silence. "You're wondering why I chose you specifically," he said. The thought crossed my mind. Your father owed money to half the criminals in the city. Any one of them could have collected you as payment. But when I looked into you, I found something interesting. He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, like they were discussing the weather. 9 jobs in 5 years. Never fired from a single one. Glowing references from employers who said you were observant, quick to learn, remembered details. One manager said you could recite the entire week's schedule from memory after seeing it once. Mabel's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. She'd never realized anyone had been paying that much attention. "You're smart," Ford continued. "You've spent your whole life making yourself invisible, but you've been watching, learning, adapting. Those are useful skills in my world. More useful than you realize." "So you married me for my memory?" "I married you because you understand survival, because you know how to read a room, how to become whatever people need to see while keeping your real thoughts hidden." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And because when I insulted you yesterday, you didn't cry or crumble. You bit back. That told me you have a spine hidden under all that practiced invisibility." Mabel set down her cup carefully. "What exactly do you want from me?" Ford pulled out a thin folder and slid it across the table. Inside were photographs, men in expensive suits, some she recognized from the wedding. "These are my lieutenants, the people who run my operations. One of them planted that bomb, maybe more than one. For 5 years, I've narrowed the list, but I can't get close enough to confirm without revealing I'm not actually helpless." He tapped one photo, a man with salt and pepper hair and cold eyes. "Victor Crane, my supposed right hand. He's consolidated more power than anyone while I've been incapacitated. He's also smart enough to never say anything incriminating within my earshot." Another photo. "Marcus Webb controls my shipping operations. Started skimming profits 2 years ago, thought I wouldn't notice." A third. "Julian Cross, in charge of security, which means if there's a traitor, he's either incompetent or complicit." Mabel studied the photos, her mind already working. "And you want me to what? Spy on them?" "I want you to be my eyes and ears in places I can't go. Charity galas where wives gossip, private dinners where men let their guard down around women they think are decorative, board meetings where I'll wheel myself in looking pathetic while you stand behind me, dismissed and underestimated, listening to everything they say when they think the cripple's pretty wife isn't paying attention." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "In 3 weeks, there's a major gathering. All my people, plus rivals from neighboring territories. It's the perfect time to force the traitor's hand. But I need to know who to target before I reveal myself. If I stand up too early, whoever's responsible will disappear. If I wait too long, they might strike again. And next time, I might not be lucky enough to survive." Mabel looked from the photos to Ford's face. "Why should I help you? You said it yourself. My father's debt is paid. I could walk out of here right now." "You could," Ford agreed, "and you'd last about 6 hours before one of my enemies snatched you off the street to use as leverage against me. Like it or not, Mrs. Montgomery, you're a target now. The safest place for you is by my side, playing the role of devoted wife." "That's not an offer, that's a threat." "It's reality." He stood, and even though Mabel was sitting, his presence filled the space. "But I'm also offering you something you've wanted your entire life. Help me, and I'll give you power. Not just protection, actual power, access to resources, the ability to disappear anyone who's ever hurt you with a single phone call." "Your father?" Ford's smile was cold. "He's currently in a facility 3 states away. Comfortable, sober for the first time in decades, and completely cut off from you. He can't call, can't visit, can't gamble, can't hurt you ever again. That's just a taste of what I can do." Mabel's throat tightened. The idea of her father locked away, unable to drag her back into his disasters, was intoxicating. "But if you walk away," Ford continued, "I'll send him back to Queens with a fresh bankroll and let nature take her course. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice, they both knew it, but Ford was offering her the illusion of agency, and Mabel understood the game well enough to play along. She stood, meeting his eyes directly. "I'll help you, but not because you're threatening me, because for the first time in my life, someone's offering me a chance to be more than a victim." Ford's expression shifted. Not quite approval, but something close. Good. Your training starts today. And Mabel, he turned toward the door, then looked back. Those sharp eyes of yours, stop hiding them. In my world, they're a weapon. Learn to use them. The education of Mabel Montgomery began with silence. Ford led her to a private office on the 3rd floor, no wheelchair in sight, and played recordings of business meetings. Not what was said, but what wasn't. The pause before someone answered a question. The subtle shift in tone when lying. The way guilty men cleared their throats. Listen to the spaces between words, Ford instructed, standing behind her chair, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. That's where truth lives. They spent hours like this. Ford would play a clip, and Mabel would close her eyes, focusing on vocal patterns, on hesitations, on the almost imperceptible changes that signaled deception. When she got it right, Ford's hand would briefly touch her shoulder, approval that sent an unexpected current through her. When she got it wrong, he'd lean down, his breath against her ear, and replay the section. Again, what do you hear? By the 3rd day, Mabel could identify a lie within seconds. Good, Ford said, and she hated how much that single word of praise affected her. Next came the code system. They needed a way to communicate in public without anyone knowing. Ford suggested hand signals. Her adjusting her bracelet meant danger. Touching her necklace meant someone was lying. Brushing her hair back meant she'd heard something important. They practiced at dinner, sitting across from each other in the formal dining room while Ford grilled her on the lieutenant's files. When she gave the signal for deception, he'd nod slightly. When she indicated danger, his posture would shift almost imperceptibly, ready to move. "You're a natural at this," Ford observed one evening, pouring wine into her glass. His fingers brushed hers on the stem, and neither of them pulled away immediately. "Makes me wonder what else you've been hiding." Mabel met his eyes over the rim of her glass. "Maybe I'm wondering the same about you." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or interest. The kind of look that made her acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and covered in more tattoos she wanted to trace with her fingers. She blinked, breaking the moment. This was dangerous territory. Ford was her temporary ally, nothing more. But he was watching her differently now, less like an acquisition and more like something he hadn't expected to find valuable. The following week, they attended their first event together, a charity gala where Ford insisted on maintaining the wheelchair facade. Mabel wore a deep emerald dress that hugged her curves, her hair pulled back in a sleek twist that emphasized the sharp architecture of her face. In the car, Ford reached out and stopped her from adjusting her bracelet, a nervous habit she'd developed. His hand engulfed hers, rough and warm. "You're not the invisible girl anymore," he said quietly. "You're my wife. That means you walk into rooms like you own them." His thumb traced along the inside of her wrist, and Mabel's pulse jumped. Ford noticed. She saw the corner of his mouth lift, but he didn't comment. The gala was a masterclass in observation. While Ford played the disabled Don, nodding politely from his chair, Mabel worked the room. She smiled at the wives who looked at her with pity. She listened to the men who spoke freely around her, assuming she was decorative rather than dangerous. And she heard everything. Victor Crane's wife mentioned a property in the Caymans Ford supposedly knew nothing about. Marcus Webb's mistress let slip that Marcus had recently acquired a second yacht. Small details that Ford had taught her to collect like ammunition. When they returned home, Ford stood immediately once the door closed, rolling his shoulders with relief. Mabel kicked off her heels and sank onto the sofa, exhausted but exhilarated. "You did well," Ford said, sitting beside her, not across from her, not at a professional distance, but close enough that their knees almost touched. "What did you learn?" As Mabel recounted the evening's intelligence, Ford listened with complete focus. His eyes tracked her face, lingering on the animated way she spoke when she was excited, on the intelligence that lit up her features when she pieced together connections he hadn't seen yet. Victor's hiding money, she concluded, and Marcus is spending more than his salary allows. That suggests that they're both stealing from me, or preparing to run. He studied her for a long moment. You have good instincts. I've had good practice reading dangerous men. Am I dangerous, Mabel? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning she wasn't ready to examine. The most dangerous, she admitted. Ford reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers traced the line of her straight nose, a touch so gentle it contrasted sharply with everything else about him. You're stronger than you think, he said quietly. Stronger than you've ever let yourself be. Mabel's breath caught. No one had ever looked at her the way Ford was looking at her now, not with pity or lust, but with recognition, like he saw exactly who she was beneath all the layers of survival she'd wrapped around herself. So are you, she whispered. Ford's hand slid to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. For a moment, Mabel thought he might kiss her. Part of her wanted him to. Part of her was terrified of what it would mean. But Ford simply held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them, then stood and walked toward his room. At the threshold, he paused. 2 weeks until the gathering. Get some rest, Mrs. Montgomery. The real work starts tomorrow. After he left, Mabel touched her face where his hand had been and wondered when exactly her temporary ally had started feeling like something far more dangerous. The Belmont Hotel ballroom glittered like a jewelry box lined with predators. Chandeliers cast golden light over designer gowns and tailored suits, over champagne glasses held by manicured hands, over smiles that never reached the eyes. This was where the city's elite gathered to pretend they'd earned their wealth through legitimate means. Mabel stood beside Ford's wheelchair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, a gesture they'd practiced until it looked natural. She wore midnight blue silk that made her olive skin glow, her hair swept up to expose the elegant line of her neck. Diamond earrings Ford had given her that morning caught the light with every turn of her head. Remember, Ford had murmured in the car, his voice low enough that only she could hear, you're not here to blend in anymore. You're here to be seen, to be remembered, so that when I finally stand, they'll realize exactly how blind they've been. Now, as they moved through the crowd, Ford wheeling himself with practiced helplessness, Mabel walking beside him with her head high, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes tracking them, calculating, judging, pitying the beautiful woman shackled to a broken man. Let them pity her. She was counting their secrets. They'd been there an hour, Mabel collecting intelligence like scattered pearls, when the crowd parted and a man approached with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Elias Montgomery was handsome in the way poisonous things often are, all charm and danger wrapped in an expensive tuxedo. He had Ford's height, Ford's build, but where Ford's face was hard edges and brutal honesty, Elias wore a smile designed to disarm. His hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, and his eyes held the calculating gleam of a man always looking for an angle. "Brother," Elias said, the word dripping with false affection, "I was hoping I'd find you here." Ford's expression remained neutral, but Mabel felt his shoulder tense beneath her hand. Elias. "And this must be the famous bride." Elias turned his full attention to Mabel, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. My, Ford, you really outdid yourself. I had no idea your taste was this refined." The implication was clear, that Ford had bought something pretty to distract from his inadequacy. "Mabel," Ford said calmly, "my half-brother, Elias. He runs our West Side operations, when he's not busy running his mouth." Elias laughed, unbothered by the barb. Still sharp, I see. At least your mind survived the accident, if even—" He gestured vaguely at the wheelchair, his smile never faltering. "Well, we're all grateful you're still with us, brother, even if you're not quite the man you used to be." The insult hung in the air, wrapped in concern like a knife in silk. Around them, conversations quieted. People were watching now, waiting to see how the broken king would respond to being mocked by his own blood. But Ford just smiled mildly, the picture of a man who'd accepted his limitations. "I'm grateful too, Elias. Grateful to have family looking out for my interests." "Someone has to." Elias turned back to Mabel, stepping closer than propriety allowed. "And someone should look out for you, Mrs. Montgomery. It must be difficult caring for a husband who can't—" He paused meaningfully. "Well, can't do much of anything anymore." Mabel felt rage ignite in her chest, not for herself, but for Ford, for the humiliation Elias was trying to inflict, the emasculation disguised as sympathy. She thought of Ford standing in their suite, powerful and whole, playing this role because strategy demanded it. Thought of the strength it took to sit there and accept mockery from this preening peacock who'd probably never worked for anything in his life. She removed her hand from Ford and took a step toward Elias, closing the distance between them. Up close, she could see the surprise flicker in his eyes. He'd expected her to shrink back, to blush, and stay silent like a good little wife. "You're absolutely right," Mabel said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "My husband can't do much of anything anymore." Elias's smile widened, triumphant. "My husband can't waste time on empty peacocking, can't spend his days preening for attention like a teenager desperate to be noticed, can't drink himself stupid at parties and call it networking, and he certainly can't mistake his own adequacy for actual power." She tilted her head, her smile razor sharp. "But then again, those sound more like your specialties than his limitations. Wouldn't you say, Elias?" The color drained from Elias's face, then rushed back in an angry flush. Around them, Mabel heard several poorly concealed laughs, saw the gleam of delight in the eyes of people who'd probably been on the receiving end of Elias's condescension before. "How dare you?" Elias started, his voice tight with fury. "I dare," Mabel interrupted, "because I'm married to a man who built an empire with his mind, not his ego. And unlike you, brother-in-law, I know the difference between a man who can't stand and a man who doesn't need to." She stepped back, returning her hand to Ford's shoulder. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my husband and I have actual important people to speak with." For a moment, Elias looked like he might do something violent. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw worked, and Mabel saw murder flash through his eyes, the same look she'd seen in Ford's when Elias had whispered to him at the wedding. Then he forced a laugh, hollow and sharp. "Spirited! How refreshing!" He looked at Ford, and there was nothing friendly in his expression now. "Careful, brother. Wives with sharp tongues sometimes cut themselves." "I'll take my chances," Ford said mildly, but Mabel felt his hand come up to cover hers on his shoulder, squeezing once, a gesture that could have been affection but felt more like a warning. To her or to Elias, she wasn't sure. Elias stalked away, and gradually the conversations around them resumed. But Mabel noticed people looking at her differently now, not with pity, but with interest, with respect. "That was reckless," Ford murmured, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "That was necessary. He'll come after you now." "Let him." Mabel looked down at Ford, saw something burning in his dark eyes that hadn't been there before. "You've spent 5 years letting men like him think you're weak. I won't do the same." Ford stared at her for a long moment, his hand still covering hers, his thumb moving in slow circles against her skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Remind me never to underestimate you." "I thought you had already learned that lesson." His smile was pure predator. "I'm learning all kinds of things about you, Mrs. Montgomery." The attack came 3 days after the gala, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Mabel was supposed to be safe. She'd gone to meet with a potential charity sponsor, part of her cover as Ford's domesticated wife, at a cafe in Midtown. The meeting had gone smoothly. Too smoothly, she'd realized later. The woman had asked all the right questions, smiled at all the right moments, and suggested they walk to see a venue 2 blocks away. Mabel had agreed because she was still learning to trust her instincts, still learning that smooth could be a trap. The alley appeared on her left, unremarkable. The woman's hand on her back, guiding her into it, felt almost friendly. By the time Mabel understood what was happening, she was 6 feet into the narrow space, and the woman was gone, replaced by 2 men who materialized from the shadows like nightmares given form. They didn't speak, didn't explain, just moved toward her with the practiced efficiency of professionals, one pulling a knife that caught the dim light like a promise. Mabel's hand flew to her bracelet, the danger signal, but there was no one to see it. She backed up, her mind racing through everything Ford had taught her. Never let them corner you. Always keep moving. Scream only if there are people who will help. Otherwise, you're just wasting air. Her back hit the brick wall. Then her earpiece crackled to life, the tiny device Ford had insisted she wear everywhere, disguised as an elegant pearl earring. "Mabel," Ford's voice, tight with controlled fury. "I can see you. 15 feet ahead, there's a fire escape. You need to run. Now." She didn't question how he could see her, didn't waste time on fear. She feinted left, and when the first man lunged, she used his momentum against him exactly as Ford had drilled into her during their late-night training sessions. Her knee came up hard into his groin, and as he doubled over, she ran. "Good girl," Ford's voice in her ear, steady despite the edge of violence beneath it. 10 feet. The ladder's on your right. Pull it down." Mabel's heels clattered on pavement. She heard the second man behind her, too close, and kicked off her shoes without stopping. Her hands found the ladder, yanked it down with strength born of pure adrenaline, and she started climbing. A hand grabbed her ankle. She kicked back hard, felt her heel connect with something that crunched, heard a satisfying grunt of pain. Then she was climbing again, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her dress tearing as she hauled herself up the metal rungs. "There's a door at the 3rd landing," Ford said. His voice was strained now, like he was fighting his own battle. "It's locked, but there's a fire axe in the emergency case. Break the glass, break the door." "Ford? Do it, Mabel. I can't—" He cut himself off and she heard something crash in the background. "I can't get to you without blowing everything. You have to save yourself." The words cut through her panic like ice water. He couldn't come, couldn't stand up and run to her rescue because 5 years of careful planning would crumble. She was alone. Except she wasn't. Not really. Mabel reached the 3rd landing, smashed the emergency case with her elbow, grabbed the axe. The men were climbing below her, their footsteps ringing on metal. She swung the axe at the door lock with everything she had. Once, twice, the wood splintered. "That's it," Ford murmured, his voice rough. "You're stronger than they are. Show them." The door gave way and Mabel stumbled into a hallway, some kind of office building. She ran, the axe still in her hands, her bare feet slapping on tile. Behind her, she heard the men crash through the broken door. "Left," Ford commanded. "There's a stairwell. Go down, not up. They'll expect up." She followed his instructions on instinct, her trust in him absolute, even as her lungs burned and her legs trembled. Down 3 flights, through another door, into what looked like a parking garage. "My car is on level B, section 3. Keys are under the driver's side wheel well. Get in, lock the doors, and wait for me. Do not leave until I get there." "Ford, they're right behind me." "I know." Something in his voice made her stop running for half a second. "Mabel, there's a gun in the glove compartment, a Glock 19, 15 rounds. You know how to use it." She did. He'd taught her last week, taking her to a private range in the dead of night, his hands covering hers as he showed her the proper stance, the right pressure, how to breathe through the recoil. I can't shoot someone, she whispered, still running. Yes, you can. Ford's voice was absolute certainty. Because you're not a victim anymore, remember? You're a Montgomery, and Montgomerys don't die in parking garages. Mabel found the car, a sleek black sedan that screamed money and power. Her shaking hands found the keys, and she threw herself into the driver's seat, locking the doors just as the two men burst into the garage. They saw her, started running toward the car. Mabel opened the glove compartment with trembling fingers. The gun was exactly where Ford said it would be. Cold and heavy and terrifying. She'd never pointed a weapon at a living person before, never imagined she'd have to. The men were 20 feet away. 15. Roll down the window, Ford said quietly in her ear, just enough to get a clear shot. Aim for center mass. 2 shots each. Then drive to the exit. Security will be waiting. I'm scared, she admitted. I know. Be scared later. Right now. Survive. 10 feet. Mabel rolled down the window 3 inches, raised the gun with both hands like Ford had taught her, and when the first man reached for the door handle, she pulled the trigger. The recoil jerked her arms up. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The man stumbled back, surprise and pain blooming across his face. She didn't wait to see him fall. She swung the gun toward the second man and fired again. Once, twice, the way Ford had drilled into her until it was muscle memory. Both men went down. Mabel's hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the key in the ignition, but she did, started the car, put it in gear, drove toward the exit on pure instinct while her mind tried to process what she'd just done. At the garage entrance, 2 security guards in Montgomery colors were indeed waiting. They waved her through without question, and suddenly she was on the street, in traffic, in the normal world where people weren't trying to kill her. Mabel, Ford's voice was rough. Are you hurt? No. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. I shot them. Ford, I shot 2 people. You defended yourself. There's a difference. A pause. Come home. I'm waiting. She drove on autopilot, her body going through the motions while her mind spiraled. By the time she pulled into the estate's garage, her hands had gone numb on the steering wheel. Ford was there, standing, actually standing beside his wheelchair like he'd been pacing. The moment he saw her, something in his expression cracked. He crossed to the car in 3 long strides, yanked open the door, and pulled her into his arms. Mabel collapsed against his chest, the gun still clutched in one hand, her entire body shaking. Ford held her like she was something precious, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist. You did it! You saved yourself. I'm sorry I couldn't. Don't. Mabel pulled back enough to look at him. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with fury and something that looked like fear. You guided me through it. That's enough. It's not. Ford's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. Elias sent them. I'm certain of it, which means we're out of time. The gathering is in 1 week. We end this then, or he'll keep coming after you. Mabel nodded, still trembling, but finding her center. Then we end it. Ford stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, respect bleeding into something deeper, something that made her breath catch. You're not who I thought you were. Neither are you. His smile was brief but genuine. Come on, let's get you inside. The emergency meeting was called for 8 p.m. on Friday in the penthouse boardroom of the Crimson Tower, Ford's building, commandeered by his own half-brother. The location was strategic, Elias's message clear. He was taking over, and there was nothing Ford could do to stop him. The room's on the 42nd floor, Ford said, studying the building schematics on his tablet. They were in his private office, the door locked, his wheelchair abandoned in the corner like a discarded costume. No elevator access to that level for wheelchairs. The main lift stops at 41. You have to take stairs to reach the boardroom. Mabel looked up from where she was reviewing the list of attendees. He's making it impossible for you to attend. He's making it humiliating, forcing me to be carried like an invalid while he calls a vote to strip me of my position. Ford's smile was cold. It's actually brilliant. Public humiliation followed by a bloodless coup. Everyone who matters will be there to witness my final degradation. Which makes it perfect for what we need. Mabel stood, smoothing down the severe black dress she'd chosen for tonight. Her hair was pulled back tight again, but this time it wasn't armor, it was war paint. Everyone who betrayed you, all in one room, expecting you to be helpless. Ford crossed to her, his movements predatory. Over the past week, since the assassination attempt, something had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained had burned away, replaced by something rawer, more dangerous. He stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. "Are you?" His hand came up to trace the line of her jaw, a gesture that had become familiar, intimate. "I've been ready for 5 years, but Mabel, after tonight, there's no going back. People will die. The city will know what I am, what we are." "Good," she said, and meant it. "I'm tired of hiding." Ford's eyes darkened with something that looked like pride and desire tangled together. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, finally cross that last line they'd been dancing around. But instead, he stepped back and straightened his tie. "Then let's show them what a resurrection looks like." The Crimson Tower's lobby was packed with Ford's organization, lieutenants, enforcers, accountants, everyone who ran the Empire's daily operations. They parted like a dark sea as Ford's guards wheeled him through, their faces carefully neutral masks hiding calculation and contempt. Mabel walked 3 steps behind, playing the dutiful wife, her heels clicking on marble. She could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispered conversations that cut off as she passed. Poor thing, shackled to a cripple. Wonder how long before she runs. Let them wonder. In 10 minutes, they'd have their answer. At the 41st floor, the elevator doors opened to reveal a problem, a flight of stairs leading up to the boardroom entrance, cordoned off with velvet ropes like this was a theater instead of a battlefield. At the top stood Elias, flanked by Victor Crane and Marcus Webb, all 3 men wearing expressions of triumphant sympathy. "Brother," Elias called down, his voice carrying, "I'm so sorry about the accessibility issue. The boardroom was the only space large enough for everyone. I hope you don't mind the inconvenience." The cruelty was exquisite. Ford would have to be carried up those stairs like a child, his supposed helplessness on full display, while Elias stood above him literally and figuratively. Ford's expression remained placid. "Not at all. I appreciate you making accommodations." He gestured, and 2 of his largest guards moved forward. They lifted Ford from the wheelchair with practiced ease, carrying him up the stairs while the assembled crowd watched in silence, so heavy it felt suffocating. Mabel followed 3 steps behind, her face carefully blank, counting each step, each witness, each person who would remember this moment for very different reasons than they expected. The boardroom was massive, a long table surrounded by leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and every available space packed with people. The major players sat at the table. Everyone else stood along the walls, a jury assembled to witness an execution. The guards carried Ford to the head of the table and placed him in a chair. Not his wheelchair, just a regular chair, highlighting his supposed inability to move under his own power. Mabel took her position standing behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, feeling the coiled tension in his muscles. Elias moved to the opposite end of the table, Victor and Marcus flanking him like loyal dogs. "Now that we're all here, let's begin. I've called this meeting because it's time we face an uncomfortable truth. Ford Montgomery is no longer capable of leading this organization." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Mabel's fingers tightened on Ford's shoulder. Their signal. Not yet. The explosion 5 years ago left him physically and mentally compromised. Out of respect for everything he built, we've tried to maintain the fiction that he's still in control. But we all know the truth. Decisions aren't being made, opportunities are being missed, our enemies smell weakness. He paused for effect, looking around the room. So I'm calling for a vote of no confidence. It's time for new leadership. Leadership that can actually stand up to our challenges. The cruel emphasis on stand drew scattered laughter. Mabel felt Ford's muscles tense further, felt the predator beneath gathering itself to strike. Does anyone oppose this motion? Elias asked, already smiling. I do. Ford's voice cut through the room like a blade. Brother, with all due respect, you don't exactly have a leg to stand on. Actually, Ford interrupted, his hands gripping the armrests, I have two. Then he stood up. The silence was absolute. Mabel stepped back, watching 5 years of careful deception crumble in a single fluid motion as Ford rose to his full, imposing height. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his neck, and smiled at the room full of people whose faces had gone chalk white. Surprise, Ford said mildly. Someone dropped their glass. The sound of shattering crystal seemed to break the spell, and suddenly, everyone was talking at once, shouting, demanding explanations, backing toward the exits. Lock the doors, Ford ordered. His loyal guards, the ones who'd known the truth all along, moved immediately. Heavy locks clicked into place. The boardroom had just become a cage. Elias stared at Ford like he was seeing a ghost. That's impossible. The doctors said what I paid them to say. Ford took a step forward, and Mabel watched with savage satisfaction as Elias instinctively stepped back. Did you really think a car bomb could kill me, little brother? I've survived worse than you could ever imagine. He began walking down the length of the table, each step deliberate, powerful, commanding. People pressed themselves against the walls, suddenly understanding exactly how much danger they were in. For 5 years, I've sat in that chair and watched, Ford continued, his voice conversational but edged with violence. Watched people steal from me, watched them conspire, watched them celebrate my weakness, and I made a list. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black notebook, holding it up for everyone to see. Every name, every betrayal, all of it documented, witnessed. His eyes found Mabel. Recorded. Mabel stepped forward, pulling out her phone. With a few taps, the large screen on the wall flickered to life, showing surveillance footage, Victor Crane in a private meeting with a rival family, Marcus Webb skimming money from shipments, Julian Cross accepting bribes, and Elias. Elias meeting with the bomber, Elias transferring funds to offshore accounts, Elias, 5 years ago, saying the words that had haunted Ford's nightmares. Make it look like an accident. The color drained from Elias's face as he realized the trap had been sprung years before he'd even known he was prey. Ford reached his half-brother, towering over him, and his smile was a death sentence. Now, he said softly, let's talk about new leadership. What happened in the Crimson Tower boardroom that night became legend in the underworld, whispered about in the kind of hushed tones reserved for myths and massacres. Ford didn't kill Elias immediately. That would have been mercy. Instead, he made his half-brother watch as every conspirator was dealt with. Victor Crane, who'd embezzled millions while pretending to manage Ford's interests, was given a choice. Return every cent, or his family would pay the debt in ways money couldn't measure. He chose the former, his hands shaking as he signed over accounts he'd thought were hidden. Marcus Webb, who'd skimmed shipments and sold information to rivals, wasn't given a choice. Ford's enforcers dragged him from the room while he screamed promises of loyalty that came 5 years too late. Julian Cross, the head of security who'd either orchestrated or ignored the bomb, simply closed his eyes when Ford stood before him. "Make it quick," he said. Ford nodded to his guards, and they escorted Julian out. The single gunshot from the stairwell 10 minutes later was quick. It was more than he deserved. Through it all, Mabel stood at the locked doors, her back straight, her expression calm. Several people had tried to push past her, believing a woman wouldn't stop them. They learned their mistake quickly. The gun Ford had given her, the same one she'd used to save herself in that parking garage, pressed against ribs and foreheads with steady hands, and not one person made it past her. She was done being underestimated. By midnight, the boardroom held only Ford's loyal inner circle and Elias, who'd been forced into a chair at gunpoint. His expensive suit was rumpled, his perfect hair disheveled, and his eyes held the wild panic of a man realizing he'd miscalculated fatally. "You were my brother," Elias said, his voice breaking. "My blood." Ford looked down at him with eyes empty of anything resembling mercy. "You put a bomb in my car. You tried to kill my wife. Blood means nothing when you're willing to spill it." "So what now? You kill me too?" "No." Ford's smile was colder than any bullet. "I'm giving you exactly what you gave me, a cage you can't escape." Within an hour, Elias Montgomery was on a plane to a black site prison Ford owned in Eastern Europe, a place where people disappeared into concrete cells and were forgotten by everyone except the guards who kept them breathing. Not dead, but no longer alive in any way that mattered. As Ford watched the plane's lights disappear into the night sky from his office window, Mabel stood beside him, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "It's done," she said quietly. "It's done." Ford turned to face her, and in her eyes, she saw exhaustion, relief, and something else, something that made her pulse quicken. "Your father's debt is paid. Has been for weeks, actually. You're free to leave, Mabel. I'll set you up anywhere you want. New identity, new life, enough money that you'll never have to work another day." Mabel had known this moment was coming, had prepared herself during the long nights when she couldn't sleep, lying in her enormous bed and thinking about the man on the other side of the wall, the man who'd given her power when everyone else had taken it away, the man who'd seen her not as property, but as a partner. "And if I don't want to leave?" she asked. Ford went very still. "Why would you stay?" "Maybe because for the first time in my life, I'm not running from something. I'm choosing something." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You asked me to be your wife as part of a strategy. I'm asking if you want me to stay as your equal." "Mabel, I know what we are, Ford. I know what you've built, what you do, what staying means, and I'm choosing it anyway. I'm choosing you." The words hung between them, honest and raw. Ford's hand came up slowly, giving her time to step back, to change her mind. When she didn't, his fingers tangled in her hair, pulling out the pins that held it in that tight, controlled knot. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, and Ford stared at her like he was seeing something precious he'd been afraid to hope for. "You deserve better than this life," he said roughly. "I deserve to choose my own life, and I choose this. I choose us." Ford kissed her then, not gentle, not tentative, but with 5 years of loneliness and a month of denied desire behind it. Mabel kissed him back with equal hunger, her hands fisting in his shirt, claiming him the way he'd claimed her that wedding night, when he'd stood up and changed everything. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ford rested his forehead against hers. "My queen," he murmured. "My king," she answered. Outside, the city sprawled below them. Their city now, their empire built on secrets and survival, and something neither of them had expected to find, each other. 6 months later, the Montgomery Empire was uncontested. Ford had consolidated power with ruthless efficiency, and anyone who'd thought his 5 years in a wheelchair meant weakness had learned otherwise. The underworld feared him again. more than they had before, because now they knew he was patient enough to wait years for revenge. But they also feared her. Mabel Montgomery had become a legend in her own right, the wife who defended her husband with a gun in a parking garage, the woman who'd stood at locked doors and turned back traitors, the queen who sat at Ford's right hand in every meeting, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, whose intelligence was as dangerous as any weapon. Tonight they stood on the balcony of their penthouse, overlooking a city that paid tribute to them in 1,000 invisible ways. Mabel's hair fell loose over her shoulders, catching the light like dark silk. She wore a simple black dress, no longer needing armor, because she'd become dangerous enough on her own. Ford stood beside her, his hand resting on her lower back, a gesture that had become their signature. Where once it might have looked possessive, now it looked like what it was: partnership. Two predators who'd found something more valuable than power: each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Ford asked quietly. "Staying?" Mabel leaned into him, watching the city lights sparkle like fallen stars. She thought about the girl she'd been, invisible, silent, desperate. Then she thought about the woman she'd become, feared, respected, free. "Not for a single second," she said. Ford smiled and pulled her closer. Below them, their empire thrived. Above them, the stars watched. And between them, something that had started as strategy and survival had transformed into something neither had believed possible. Love forged in fire and sealed in blood, the kind that lasted forever.